I am here today at the Department of Historic Resources to work on a project with Laura Galkey, who is the chief curator here. And we're going to be looking at three different archaeological sites in Virginia. We're going to be looking at what the artifacts can tell us about the everyday life of those people that lived at each of the sites.
Hello, my name is Laura Galkey, and I'm an archaeologist with the Department of Historic Resources. And today we're going to be working with artifacts from sites that were occupied by African Americans. But first I want to give you a little bit of background into what archaeology is and what archaeological sites are. How do you learn about the past? How do you know about what things happened in the past? Well, you can ask someone, but maybe their memory isn't so good, or maybe you want to know about the distant past. Well, archaeologists are the people that study the human past. We don't study dinosaurs, we study what people did in the past. And the evidence we use is we'll talk to people. Sometimes people remember things and they can tell us what happened. We can also look at documents, but if they're written on paper, we can have a preservation problem there. Paper doesn't last a very long time unless you take special care of it. And then finally, artifacts. And these are the physical remains that are left behind from people who lived in the past. And that's an area of evidence that can be really exciting, because most often what archaeologists are looking at are what people threw away. And it tells us about their everyday lives. When there are documents are usually created when something special happens. They're often biased to people who had time to write or who had the materials to write. They don't usually capture people's everyday lives, but artifacts can be very revealing about what people's everyday life was like. And today, you're going to have a chance to analyze some for yourself to learn about early Virginia African Americans. So the Africans that came to Virginia tended to come enslaved as captive, and they came from the western part of the continent of Africa. Now in Africa, these people were husbands and wives, they were doctors, they were carpenters, they were farmers, and they were brought here against their will and brought to various areas and various plantations in Virginia. While we don't have a number of portraits of enslaved Africans, we do have one in particular I wanted to focus on. George and Martha Washington enslaved Hercules. And while Washington was serving as president in Philadelphia, Hercules served as his chef. And he was well known for being an excellent chef. His standards in the kitchen were second to none, and the dishes he made were wonderful. He was known for being a very fine dresser as well. He even had a gold-tipped cane. And Philadelphia had a very large population of free African Americans. And there was a law in Philadelphia that if you were enslaved and brought there and lived there for 6 months or more, you could apply to be free. Now the Washington's response to this was to take Hercules back to Mount Vernon, take Hercules back to Virginia every 6 months to ensure that he stayed enslaved, and then they'd bring him back to Philadelphia. Well, one day, in fact, it was on George Washington's birthday, Hercules ran away from his home at Mount Vernon. A portrait was done of him. You can see in that beautiful portrait what a fine dresser he was. A visitor to Mount Vernon, just a few months later, met one of Hercules' children, his daughter, and said, "Don't you feel bad that you won't see your father again?" And the daughter replied, "I am happy because he is free." And it tells you this young girl, the the heart-wrenching conditions that existed in these families that could be split apart at any time, and that even when they were split apart, knowing that her father was free filled her with joy. It also is a lesson in the extent to which people went through to keep their labor force enslaved. So what we're going to be looking at here are some artifacts that were recovered from a household that was lived in by Black Virginians in the early 1800s. It was located in Alexandria in a neighborhood called Haiti. And it was named after the Caribbean island where a revolution had taken place and the enslaved people had gained their freedom. So in this particular household was a home to free African Americans. When we look at the various artifacts from their home, we can learn a great deal about what their lives were like and what their house was like. So I talked about artifacts earlier. Artifacts are anything that's made or used or modified by people. They're the physical remains from their past lives. Archaeologists look at what they're made from, how they're used, sometimes who used them. Sometimes things are used by children and not by adults. Sometimes things are used by men and not by women. These artifacts can tell us a lot about everyday lives. So here's an artifact. It's made of fired clay. You might recognize it. It's an example of a brick. Once archaeologists identify what an artifact is, we'll categorize them into broader functional categories that help us understand the site better. So a brick is an example of something from which the house was made from. So in terms of our broad functional categories, we would put that under architectural. Other broad categories include clothing, food, what kind of things did people eat, things that people engaged in during their free time, leisure activities, work. What artifacts are present that reflected what people did to earn a living? What sort of personal items did folks have? These are the sorts of broad categories that archaeologists look at to understand what happened in the past. So here's another example of fired clay, but this fired clay is a little bit more refined. This is a ceramic, but it's not complete. It's fragmentary, it's broken. And archaeologists find broken items a lot, but they still tell us a great deal. So this is an example of a ceramic, and we're going to put that in the foodways area. Here's another example of a ceramic. It's also fragmentary. Look at its straight sides. This is part of a mug. I'm going to put that in foodways as well. You might recognize this. It's got teeth on either side. It's also fragmentary. A part of it's broken off on this side. Do you recognize it? This is a comb. And we'll put stuff like this under the health and hygiene category. Things that people use to groom themselves and to keep themselves healthy. This is a nail. This type of artifact was used to hold boards together, to nail one board to another. Now, of our various categories, is it food? I wouldn't want to eat a nail. Is it for health and hygiene? No, I don't think so. Of our functional categories, this one best fits in architecture. And what that tells us is we have brick and we have nails. So the nail tells us that part of this home was made from wood, and the brick tells us part of it was made from brick. Often chimneys are made from brick. If you can't afford to make the whole house of brick, you can make that part of wood, make the chimney of brick. That's important. That helps prevent any fire, your chimney catching fire if it's made from wood. We'll see other examples of households where even the chimney's made of wood. Here's another example of an architectural artifact. This is a fragment of mortar, and these are used to hold bricks together. So we're going to put that in our architectural category. So we're getting some pretty good evidence that tells us about what this house looked like. Here are two fragments that mend. It's made of ceramic, and it's largely complete. This is an example of a smoking pipe. Something people would have used at this time, likely to smoke tobacco. So which of our functional categories would this be appropriate for? I like the idea of this going into our personal leisure category, something that folks did in their spare time. Here's an artifact that's still in its bag. It's a coin. Archaeologists don't find coins very often, but this one's rather special. Someone's put a hole through it. What would be the purpose of putting a hole through a coin? Sometimes people would wear coins as an amulet, as a protective amulet, sort of for good luck. Another good reason for poking a hole through a coin is if your clothes don't have pockets, this can ensure they stay with you. You can actually literally tie your currency to you. I'm going to put that in the personal leisure category. So here are some artifacts that are really small. These are called hook and eye fasteners. These are used in clothing. So sometimes you have buttons. Another way to fasten your clothing together is using these hook and eye fasteners. So now we have something for the clothing category. The clothing itself doesn't preserve. Things like leather and cloth tend not to preserve in the ground over time. But the fasteners, the buttons and the hook and eye fasteners, if they're made of materials that survive a long time, leave evidence for archaeologists to discover. Well, this looks like a fun bag. These are made from glass. You probably recognize what these are. These are marbles. What does that tell us about the site occupants? It tells us that children lived here. This is definitely something for our leisure category. And it tells us that we have a family living here. This next artifact you might not recognize. Archaeologists find a lot of them, and they were imported into the United States by the hundreds of thousands during the colonial period. It fits in your pocket. This is a complete one. Can you guess what it is? This is a mouth harp. People could play musical tunes on it and enjoy some of their leisure time this way. Sort of enhances life, doesn't it, when you have a little bit of music in it and entertainment? So this is definitely something for our personal leisure category. This is a family that has children, that have marbles, they enjoy smoking tobacco, and there's music in their lives too. Typically, music doesn't leave us a lot of evidence. sheet music wouldn't last in the archaeological record very long, and most instruments aren't very durable in the ground either. So these mouth harps are one of the few things that were popular and that archaeologists find fairly often. So what's left to learn about this family? Well, they're pretty tiny objects. Both of these are from the same category. So we have some burned seeds and some animal bone. What category might these belong in? They're complete, they're not fragmentary. Bone and seeds. These are evidence of the foodways, the diet that these people enjoyed. And this can tell us a great deal about whether they're shopping at stores, whether families have to go out and hunt. Maybe their bones are, of the animals are comprised primarily of turkey and deer, or maybe it's mostly domestic animals like chickens and cows. That can tell us how much the family enhanced their diet between what they could buy at the market and what they hunted for themselves. Here's a curious item. It's mostly complete. It's made of bone. It's got all these little holes at the top. Can you guess how this was used? You probably used one today. This is an example of a toothbrush. And remember, we talked about how some things preserve in the ground better than others. Archaeologists can often find these bone-handled toothbrushes, but the bristles don't survive in the archaeological record. The bristles at this time tended to be made from boar hair, and boars from Siberia were especially good for tooth bristles because they were really thick. So, a toothbrush. So what category does this go into? Certainly not clothing or architecture. It's not right for foodways either. I'm going to put this in our health and hygiene category, along with our comb. Now that you've learned a little bit about artifacts and what they can tell us about the past, we're going to do a little exercise that involves two other sites that were lived in by Black Virginians. And this exercise has two components. First, you're going to have a chance, using pictures of these artifacts, to analyze what they were, who might have used them, and which of our broad functional categories they belong to. You'll catalog your artifacts using your catalog sheet, and the functional categories are listed right on the sheet, so don't worry if you can't remember them. Then, the second part, once you've analyzed your artifacts, divided them into these categories, you're going to do that for the second site as well, and then we're going to compare all three sites to one another to see what we can learn about the past. This site, Site A, is one of a number of quarters for enslaved people that Thomas Jefferson had. These artifacts you'll be able to analyze into these functional categories. The second site, Site B, is located in Williamsburg. It's an earlier site dating from as early as 1690s. Make sure as you're looking at the architectural material, you pay close attention to the nails, how they're made, and the type of structure in which these people lived. So here we are at our Williamsburg quarter. This is the earliest site of the three sites we're looking at. And it's got a very different way of organizing the people that live within it. As we look at the artifacts and the functional categories, there are some noticeable patterns here. The foodways has a lot of representation, doesn't it? examples of ceramics, but the ceramics aren't quite as elegant as the ones we see in Alexandria in the early 1800s. Other items associated with the foodways include some walnuts, oyster shell, seeds, and animals, especially fish. Personal and leisure items, not a lot present. We do have a smoking pipe fragment and a shark tooth. Evidence for work include we have part of a scissors. Did you recognize this scissors fragment? There's a fishing hook and this small piece of chert gunflint. This demonstrates that the people here were able to hunt to supplement their diet. Architectural material, there's not a great deal. It's a very small amount of brick and a little bit of mortar. This was a structure that was built to hold many unrelated people, and that characterized what life was like for the enslaved people who were forced here in Virginia at this time. If you look at the plan of the home, you'll see that there are a number of small pits that the occupants dug into the floor to keep their personal belongings in during the day. Another interesting thing about the assemblage of artifacts here is what's not here. Is there any evidence that you see that children lived here? There are no artifacts that survive that indicate that children lived here. How about the clothing category? No. And this is part of the preservation issue that archaeologists contend with. So these folks wore things made from leather and cord and cloth that didn't preserve in the record. They didn't have buttons that preserve for much longer. Those hook and eye fragments that are made of metal that we saw in the Haiti site aren't present either. Along our theme of interesting things that aren't present at this site is the health and hygiene category. Did you see anything from the assemblage that fits into health and hygiene? No, not really. And this is a couple of factors. This is a factor of the fact that this is a dormitory full of unrelated people who are being worked so hard that health and hygiene isn't very much a priority. This is also a factor of the fact that people in general didn't have a lot of tools to take care of health and hygiene, not as many in the 1690s as certainly evolve into as the 1700s go on and the 1800s go on. In addition, there's a preservation issue as well here. So there may have been some items made from wood or cloth that were used, but just don't preserve in the archaeological record. So let's look at the assemblage from Site A. Remember, this is the home of some of the enslaved people that lived at Monticello, who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Once again, the foodways category is well represented, isn't it? There's a wide variety of ceramics, glassware, animal bone. Did you see the peach pit? Even a fork. Other categories we have include items that reflect work. This horseshoe is an example of that. How about the architectural materials? What did this home look like? We have examples of brick. Here's one of those nails. Look carefully at the head of the nail. You'll see it was individually hammered. This tells us that this is a site from the colonial era. This site is 100 years later than the Williamsburg site. They both were lived in by enslaved African Americans, but this one was very different. Another example of something I would put in the architectural category is this hook. This would have been affixed to the wall, and you could have hung things on it, maybe a coat or a bag or something. I would put that in the architectural category. Let's look at some of these other categories. Clothing. That's pretty well represented here, isn't it? We have an example of a buckle, a small bead, and even a metal button. These enslaved people dressed pretty well. The personal leisure category, in it I placed the coin. I also put this tack in it. This tack could reflect part of a piece of furniture. So leather is stretched over a wooden frame, and they would use tacks like this to keep the leather over the wooden frame of a chair or a couch. These can also be used as part of horse tack, so the bridles and stuff that are on horses. And so this could also go in the work category, potentially. Hard to say. And it's hard for archaeologists to tell sometimes as well. I also put in the personal leisure category this piece of lead shot. Again, evidence that this family had firearms and could hunt for extra food for their table. This last category, health and hygiene, I didn't find anything that could go in here. This matches pretty well with the quarter that we saw from Williamsburg, but is different from the household in Haiti, Alexandria. Is there any evidence for children at this site? I don't think so. Now's the part where we can really start thinking about these three different sites and comparing what the lives of these people were in Virginia at this time. So consider what archaeology tells us about these families and these people who were brought here as captives. Their everyday lives weren't written about. There's not a lot of ways that we can tell about what their lives were like. These material remains, even though they're broken, can reveal a great deal about what everyday life was like. As we look at these different sites and compare these broader categories of materials, it breathes new life into the past and tells us something about these families that we had no other way to discover. Consider the free African American family in Alexandria in the Haiti neighborhood. Their attention to health and hygiene left a lot of evidence for us to recover. This was a privilege that they as free people could engage in. And it also reflects American values of the time. These things were more important to do as well. Consider how much more evidence there is for leisure activities at this free household as well. We might not know their names, but we do know something about how they spent their free time. This music harp, this mouth harp, tells us that music was a part of their lives. And we can infer that storytelling and singing was part of their lives. A great enhancement for a family. Leisure activities like smoking and the toy marbles we find there indicate that there was some nice enhancements to their daily life, and that this was a family, that they had children as well. One of the important architectural differences that we find between these sites can be seen in the nails. I'm going to bring these in for a close-up. So if you look carefully at the heads of these nails, you'll see one has a number of different hammer marks on it, and the other is completely flat. This flat one is a machine-made nail. And the one that has multiple hits on the top is an example of a wrought nail. This helps us date the sites. look at the number of clothing items that the family at Monticello enjoy, buckles and buttons and beads. We compare that to the Williamsburg house, which is occupied by a number of unrelated people in a dormitory-style structure. There's very little evidence for clothing there. They wore clothes, but they weren't made from the kind of materials that archaeologists can recover after hundreds of years. This archaeological material breathes life into families and people who lived in captivity, who were brought here against their will, or who were descended from people who were brought here against their will, and provide us information that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. It's my job here at the Department of Historic Resources to preserve these materials, because the stories we tell today about these aren't the end. We're not in the final chapter of this story. Additional recording and study of these materials will reveal new stories in the future.